Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When Trevor Hale, a fiercely independent engineer, builds a simple fence on his hard-earned land, he sparks a ruthless battle with a powerful HOA determined to seize control. What begins as a property dispute soon unravels into a tense, high-stakes legal war. My name is Trevor Hale. I'm a 39-year-old structural engineer, the kind of man who values clean lines, order, and above all, independence. Maybe it's my profession, or maybe it's just who I am, but I've always been the type who likes knowing I'm standing on solid ground, legally, financially, and personally. So, when I decided to buy a piece of property to get away from the constant hum of the city, I knew exactly what I wanted: space, freedom, and absolutely no meddling neighbors or HOA boards breathing down my neck. After months of searching, I found the perfect place: 6 acres of land just outside of town. It backed up to a new development called Valley Pines, a pristine suburban maze of near-identical homes, immaculate lawns, and an aggressive homeowners association that, frankly, I wanted no part of. That's why I was meticulous before I signed anything. I hired a real estate attorney, pored over cadastral maps, pulled property records from the county clerk's office, and double-checked every line of the legal description. This land was clean, outside the HOA boundaries, free and clear. It was mine, no strings attached. The property had charm, a bit overgrown, sure, but beautiful in its ruggedness. Rolling grassy patches, some old trees on the edges, and a slightly crumbling barn that I saw not as a liability, but as a project. The first few weeks after I closed the deal were blissful. I moved in some tools, set up a small workshop, began clearing brush, and even planned where I'd install solar panels and maybe a greenhouse. For the first time in years, I could breathe without feeling like someone was watching over my shoulder. But then came the neighbors. At first, I barely noticed them, a few folks walking their dogs a little too close to my fence line, some kids darting across the edge of my property on dirt bikes. It wasn't ideal, but I figured it was harmless. I put up some simple private property signs, thinking that would be enough. It wasn't. As spring turned into summer, the trickle turned into a flood. Dogs ran across my backyard as if it were a public park. Teenagers cut through my side lot on ATVs, tearing up the ground I had just reseeded. A few times, I even saw couples strolling hand in hand right past my workshop like they were out for an afternoon walk. On my land. It grated on me. I'm not the confrontational type, but I take pride in what I own and in maintaining clear boundaries. So, I did what any reasonable property owner would do. I decided to put up a fence. Not a cheap chain-link fence slapped together overnight, but a solid professional-grade wooden fence that ran precisely along my property lines, marked to the inch. I hired a local contractor, pulled the necessary permits, and watched every step of the process to make sure it was done right. When the last post was set and the final board nailed in, I stood back and admired it. Clean, sturdy, and mine. Little did I know, that fence, that simple legal act of defining the edge of my world, would set off a chain reaction I never saw coming, and it would drag me into a fight I never wanted but couldn't afford to walk away from. The morning after the fence was finished, I stepped outside with a cup of coffee in hand, feeling satisfied for the first time in weeks. The air smelled clean, the wood looked sharp against the green backdrop, and for once, I felt like I'd regained control of my space. But as I reached into the mailbox, my fingers closed around an envelope that immediately set off alarm bells in my mind. The letterhead was unmistakable. Valley Pines Homeowners Association. I tore it open right there on the porch. Notice of violation, it read. Unauthorized construction disrupting the visual standards and architectural harmony of Valley Pines. Daily fines of $700 will be imposed until the structure is removed or brought into compliance with HOA regulations. I stood there for a full minute, blinking, rereading every word. It was almost comical, except it wasn't. I wasn't a member of the HOA. I had bought this land specifically because it was outside their jurisdiction. I hadn't signed any covenants, I wasn't bound by their rules, and yet here they were, acting like I owed them something. I dialed the number listed on the letter, pulse quickening, jaw tight. Valley Pines HOA. This is Clarissa Reynolds speaking. Her voice was smooth, polite, the kind of tone that drips with false sweetness and thinly veiled superiority. Hi, Clarissa. This is Trevor Hale, owner of the 6-acre property adjacent to Valley Pines. I just received a violation notice from your office. There's been a mistake. I'm not part of your HOA. A pause. Then that same syrupy voice. Ah, Mr. Hale. Yes, I'm aware of your property. While you may not be formally under our association yet, Valley Pines has been undergoing a phase of boundary expansion. Properties directly adjoining our community are considered within our visual influence. The fence you constructed fails to meet our established aesthetic guidelines. I gripped the phone tighter. You're fining me $700 a day for a legal fence on private property because you don't like how it looks from your side. Mr. Hale, Clarissa continued smoothly, Valley Pines is a cohesive community. We strive to maintain harmony, and unfortunately, your fence disrupts that balance. I would encourage you to work with our Architectural Review Committee to bring it into compliance. I almost laughed. Let me be perfectly clear. I am not under your authority. My property is not part of Valley Pines. You have no jurisdiction here, no covenants, no signed agreements, no legal standing. Clarissa's voice cooled. Mr. Hale, I'm afraid you misunderstand. HOA membership isn't always optional when a neighborhood expands. I suggest you consult legal counsel before ignoring these notices. We've already documented the violations, and the fines are accruing. I hung up, heart pounding, hands shaking, not with fear, but with fury. It wasn't just arrogance. It was calculated pressure. Over the next few days, the situation escalated faster than I could have imagined. 3 men showed up at my gate, one with a clipboard, one with a camera, and one taking measurements along the fence line. They introduced themselves as members of the Architectural Review Committee. Without asking permission, they walked the perimeter of my property, snapping photos and scribbling notes, while one of them casually remarked, "You're up to $4,200 in fines as of this morning." I told them firmly and without hesitation to leave my property. They smirked, muttered about non-compliance, and strolled away like they owned the ground under their feet. That evening, I noticed my mailbox stuffed with flyers, messages from the HOA about neighborhood cohesion, responsible participation, and subtle digs about neighbors who refuse to integrate. Then the whispers started. Neighbors I'd once waved to turned cold. Sideways glances replaced casual greetings. Someone even shared a post in the local HOA Facebook group, a screenshot forwarded to me by a sympathetic coworker, calling me the problem neighbor, the outsider who's lowering property values, and the man ruining the spirit of Valley Pines. My name, my address, plastered online for anyone to see. It was clear this wasn't just about a fence. It was about control, and they wanted to see if I'd break under pressure. But I wasn't about to fold, not after everything I'd built here. If they wanted a fight, they were about to learn just how hard I could hit back. By the end of the week, I could feel the walls closing in, not physically, but socially. The tension around Valley Pines had thickened like a storm cloud hanging over my property. What had started as letters and fines had now evolved into something colder, more calculated. Early one morning, I looked out my window and spotted 3 people standing just outside my fence line. I recognized 2 of them, the same Architectural Review Committee members who'd trespassed days before, and the third was a tall man in a navy blazer I hadn't seen yet. Clipboard in hand, he pointed at various parts of my fence, nodding thoughtfully as the others took pictures. I stepped outside, sharp and direct. "Can I help you?" They turned slowly, smiles tight, eyes flat. "We're just here to conduct a follow-up inspection, Mr. Hale," the tall man said. "The HOA has assigned a special committee to review the extent of the violations." "There are no violations," I shot back. "This is private property. You have no right to inspect anything on this land." He gave a slow, patronizing smile. "That's where we disagree. Given the ongoing boundary adjustments, we believe it's in the community's best interest to document everything thoroughly." I ordered them off my land. They walked away, but not before making sure I saw them snap a few last photos. That evening, as I drove home from work, I noticed neighbors pausing on their lawns to watch me pull into my driveway. No more waves, no more casual nods, just stiff backs and narrowed eyes. It wasn't paranoia, it was deliberate. I found another HOA flyer shoved in my mailbox, but this one was different. It didn't mention neighborhood standards or architectural harmony. Instead, it carried an undertone of menace. Residents who refuse to cooperate with the community risk creating a hostile environment for everyone. The next day, it escalated again. A local acquaintance forwarded me posts from the Valley Pines HOA Facebook group, now riddled with accusations against me. They called me a reckless landowner, a dangerous presence, someone who was inviting legal action. One post read, "If he wants to live here, he should follow the rules like the rest of us. Why does he think he's special?" My name, my address, my photo. All there, like I was some kind of community enemy. Meanwhile, I started receiving thinly veiled threats. An anonymous letter appeared in my mailbox. Why not just take the fence down? Things would be easier for you. One night, I heard someone drive by and shout, "Sell the lot and get out." I wasn't blind to what was happening. This was textbook social pressure. The HOA wasn't just trying to hit me with fines. They were trying to isolate me, break me down, make me feel like the enemy in my own home. But here's the thing about me. I don't respond well to bullies. I took action. I installed security cameras along every inch of the fence line, upgraded the locks on my gates, and set up motion-activated floodlights. I began documenting everything. Every letter, every flyer, every online post, every time a committee member hovered near my property. I contacted a lawyer, explained the situation, and made it clear I was ready to fight. Still, the pressure didn't let up. That week, I received an official summons from the HOA. They were scheduling a hearing through their internal dispute resolution process, a so-called community court. According to the document, they intended to impose escalating fines and potentially ordered the forced removal of my fence. The arrogance was breathtaking, but I wasn't just angry anymore. I was focused. This wasn't going to be a quiet neighborly dispute solved with a handshake. This was shaping up to be a legal war. And if they wanted to drag me into court, they were about to discover I had no intention of showing up unprepared. Hiring Linda Parsons was the best move I could have made. She came highly recommended. A sharp, no-nonsense property rights attorney with a reputation for dismantling overreaching HOAs. When I first sat across from her in her downtown office, I laid everything out: the letters, the fines, the committee inspections, the social shaming campaign, the official summons to their so-called community court. Linda listened carefully, her expression calm but focused, occasionally jotting down notes. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, "They're bluffing, but they're good at it. HOA boards thrive on intimidation. They push as far as they can until someone pushes back." That was exactly what I needed to hear. Linda got to work immediately. The first step was straightforward. She reviewed my property records, the original deed, the zoning maps, and the official county boundaries. Every line confirmed what I already knew. My land was independent, never included in the Valley Pines HOA jurisdiction, and not subject to their covenants or restrictions. There was no overlap, no shared agreement, no legal tie between me and them. Next, she drafted and delivered an official cease and desist letter to the Valley Pines HOA board. In precise, cold legal language, she demanded they immediately stop all attempts to impose fines, withdraw the community court summons, remove all derogatory public statements, and formally acknowledge they had no authority over my property. She gave them a strict deadline and warned that failure to comply would result in civil action. Predictably, they didn't back down. Within a week, a new document arrived at my home, an updated map showing the recently expanded HOA boundary, conveniently now including my 6 acres. Linda took one look at it and scoffed. "This is fabricated," she said flatly. They're attempting to retroactively redraw their lines and apply them to a property they never had a claim on in the first place. This isn't just overreach, this is deliberate fraud. That's when we shifted gears. Linda prepared a counterclaim, a formal lawsuit in county court, charging the HOA with fraudulent misrepresentation, attempted extortion through false fines, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and unlawful interference with a private property. She wasn't aiming small either. Linda made it clear to me, "We're not just defending you against their claims. We're going on offense. If they want to play this game, we're going to make sure they pay for every inch of ground they try to steal." What startled me was how fast the evidence piled up once we went digging. Through public records and a few insider contacts Linda had, we discovered that the president of the HOA, Clarissa Reynolds, had been working closely with a county land officer to push through a boundary revision behind closed doors. No public notices, no neighborhood vote, no due process. Just a handshake deal designed to quietly fold my property into the HOA, giving them leverage they never earned. Why? Linda suspected it wasn't just about the fence. There were whispers of a development project, a park expansion tied to Valley Pines that would require land access across my property. Clarissa's maneuvering wasn't personal, it was strategic. My land was a key puzzle piece, and she intended to get it, one way or another. Knowing this hardened my resolve. I wasn't just fighting for a fence anymore. I was fighting for the right to stand on my own land without being pushed, tricked, or squeezed out by people who thought they could play games with rules they invented as they went. By the time we filed the lawsuit, I could feel a shift in the air. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't on the defensive, and the HOA. They were about to learn they'd picked a fight with the wrong man. The day we filed the counterclaim, everything shifted. Up to that point, the HOA had been the aggressor, sending notices, handing down fines, staging inspections, and working their social machine to isolate me. But now, they were the ones served. Clarissa Reynolds, president of Valley Pines HOA, got the first taste when a process server handed her the official lawsuit in front of her home, right as she stood chatting with neighbors on her manicured front lawn. Linda's legal team worked fast. They compiled every piece of evidence we had. The fabricated boundary map, the letters and fines, the photos of the so-called committee walking my land without permission, the online posts designed to turn the neighborhood against me. They pulled records from the county, showing that the official zoning documents had not been updated to reflect any new HOA boundaries, meaning that Clarissa's internal HOA documents were nothing more than personal fantasy, unsupported by any legal process. But what cracked the case wide open was something we hadn't expected. Through a discovery request, Linda forced the HOA to turn over internal communications, emails between Clarissa and the HOA board, and, most importantly, emails between Clarissa and a certain mid-level land office clerk. In those emails, Clarissa had openly discussed her plans to absorb my property into the HOA footprint, talking about rebranding the neighboring lots, cleaning up visual inconsistencies, and, most damningly, mentioning her personal stake in a land access deal tied to the future public park expansion. She wanted my land not because my fence offended her aesthetic sensibilities, but because it blocked a lucrative pathway for development. When Linda showed me those emails, I sat back in my chair and exhaled hard. So it was never about community rules, I muttered. It was always about money. Linda smiled thinly. It's always about money. When we arrived at the preliminary hearing, the atmosphere was electric. Clarissa showed up dressed sharply, flanked by a lawyer from a high-end local firm. She didn't look worried, not yet. I noticed how she avoided making eye contact with me across the courtroom, and when she did glance my way, her expression was one of pure disdain. Linda, by contrast, was calm, collected, and precise. In front of the judge, she laid out our argument clearly. My land had never been part of the HOA. The HOA had no legal basis to impose fines or regulations on my property. The association had knowingly fabricated documents to suggest otherwise. Their actions constituted harassment, fraud, and a calculated attempt to seize private land through deception. Clarissa's lawyer tried to dismiss our claims as misunderstandings, painting the HOA as a well-meaning but occasionally overzealous body simply trying to protect neighborhood cohesion. But the judge wasn't buying it, especially not after Linda submitted the internal emails into evidence. The judge's face tightened as he read through the excerpts. "This is serious," the judge said, looking directly at Clarissa. "You're not just dealing with a neighborly dispute here. You're dealing with allegations of fraud and abuse of authority. If these claims hold up, you could be facing not only civil penalties, but potential criminal charges." That was the first time I saw Clarissa's composure crack. She shifted uncomfortably, her jaw tightening, her hands gripping the edge of the table. By the end of the hearing, the judge ruled that our case would proceed to full trial, rejecting the HOA's motion to dismiss. More importantly, he granted a preliminary injunction, meaning the HOA was immediately barred from imposing any further fines, taking enforcement actions, or attempting to enter my property. They were effectively frozen. Outside the courthouse, Linda turned to me with a confident nod. "We're not just stopping their attack," she said. "We're turning it around, and we're going to make sure they feel every bit of pressure they tried to put on you." For the first time in months, I felt like I could stand a little taller. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. But the tide had shifted, and now, finally, I was the one driving the fight. The trial moved faster than I'd expected. Linda told me that once fraud was on the table, judges didn't like to let cases linger. We were scheduled for a full hearing within 6 weeks, and in that time, she worked like a machine, gathering witnesses, organizing documents, preparing cross-examinations. When the day finally arrived, the courtroom was packed. Residents from Valley Pines filled the benches, curious to watch the HOA president they once admired sit in the defendant's chair. Some faces looked anxious, others angry. Word had spread about the internal emails. People had questions about what Clarissa had been doing behind the scenes, and those questions weren't going away quietly. Clarissa sat rigid at the defense table, flanked by 2 lawyers. I noticed she no longer smiled confidently. Her eyes darted constantly between her attorneys, the judge, and the people in the gallery. Linda started strong. She laid out the basic facts for the jury. I owned a private 6-acre lot, legally outside the HOA boundary. The HOA had no legal jurisdiction over my land. The HOA, under Clarissa's leadership, had imposed fines and issued threats anyway. And most damning of all, Clarissa had orchestrated a false boundary expansion by forging documents and working with a land office clerk to create the appearance of authority. When the internal emails were read aloud in court, there was a ripple across the gallery. Words like absorb the lot, control the access route, and he'll break if we push hard enough landed like hammers. Clarissa's lawyers objected repeatedly, but the judge allowed almost everything in. The paper trail was too solid to ignore. The HOA tried to argue that it was all a misunderstanding, that Clarissa was acting on behalf of community interests, not personal gain. But Linda wasn't having it. She brought up the financial projections Clarissa had shared with the board about the future park development and how the land deal's value hinged on securing rights through my property. She even called in a whistleblower, one of the HOA board members who'd resigned quietly months before, who testified that several board members had raised concerns but were overridden by Clarissa. It was brutal. Clarissa's carefully curated public image collapsed in front of everyone, not just as a fussy, power-hungry HOA president, but as a schemer who had risked the entire association's legal standing for her personal ambitions. When it came time for the verdict, I sat still, hands folded, heart pounding. The jury found in my favor on every count. The judge declared the fabricated documents void, annulled all fines and actions taken by the HOA against me, and ordered Valley Pines HOA to pay me $280,000 in damages, covering legal costs, emotional distress, reputational harm, and punitive penalties. But it didn't stop there. Clarissa herself was referred to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation. Within a month, she was charged with document fraud, abuse of position, and conspiracy to defraud. The plea deal she eventually took gave her 18 months of probation, permanent removal from the HOA, and a court order barring her from serving in any fiduciary role or leadership position in a homeowners association for the next decade. Valley Pines was left in shambles. The remaining HOA board members resigned en masse. A temporary committee was formed to rebuild the governance structure from scratch. Homeowners began demanding audits, accountability, and total transparency. What had started as a battle over a fence ended up shaking the entire neighborhood to its foundation. For me, the outcome was clear. I won. But it wasn't just about the legal victory or the money. It was about standing my ground, refusing to let entitled neighbors and power-hungry figures dictate terms on land that had never belonged to them. As Linda and I walked out of the courthouse, reporters clustered nearby, cameras flashing. I kept my head down, shook Linda's hand firmly, and gave one short statement to the press. This wasn't just about a property line. This was about the right to be left alone, and I'm grateful the court saw it that way. I didn't stick around for interviews or victory laps. I just wanted to go home, to my land, my fence, my quiet, to the place I'd fought so hard to protect. The weeks after the trial were the quietest I'd experienced in months, and I savored every minute. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could walk my own property without feeling eyes on me, without checking the mailbox in dread, without wondering what new threat or notice would show up next. The land was still mine, just as it had been from day one, but now it felt secured. One of the first things I did was invest in new security. I didn't want to live in paranoia, but after what I'd been through, I knew better than to trust that people would just leave me alone out of decency. I installed advanced motion-activated cameras at every entrance point, linked directly to my phone with cloud backup. I added floodlights, reinforced my gates, and posted clear signs at the perimeter. Private property. No trespassing. Not part of HOA. All unauthorized access will be prosecuted. It wasn't just about protection. It was about sending a message. There would be no second act. What surprised me most was how dramatically the neighborhood atmosphere shifted. People who once turned their backs now crossed the street to avoid me. No more fake smiles, no more passive-aggressive waves. The HOA had fallen into disarray. Clarissa was gone, the old board had resigned, and the temporary committee running things was focused entirely on internal damage control. They didn't want to fight with me. They wanted to survive. A few neighbors did approach me, cautiously, over the next few weeks. They weren't there to apologize, not exactly, but to acknowledge what had happened. One middle-aged man, whose house bordered mine on the east side, came by one evening. He stood awkwardly at my gate, hands in his pockets, and said, "Didn't know half the stuff they were pulling. Guess we should have paid more attention." I nodded once, politely but firmly. I didn't need their validation, just their silence. The bigger story, though, was what happened inside Valley Pines itself. The fallout from the lawsuit cracked open years of simmering discontent. Without Clarissa running the show, residents started sharing stories. Past abuses, ridiculous fines, unchecked power. People who had once whispered in private were now openly demanding reform. The temporary committee called for a full audit, and when the numbers came out, they revealed how mismanaged the HOA had been. Everything from unnecessary legal fees to vanity landscaping projects meant only to impress buyers. I stayed out of it. That was their world, their mess. My world was 6 acres of hard-won independence, and I was determined to keep it that way. Still, I wasn't blind to the irony. The fight over my fence, the battle that started because one woman thought she could push me into line, had ended up shaking an entire neighborhood awake. People were rethinking how much power they wanted to hand over to a board just because they liked a uniform lawn. They were starting to understand what I'd known from the beginning. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can own isn't just property. It's autonomy. A month after the trial, I stood at the edge of my land at sunset, watching the light hit the fence I'd fought so hard to keep. The wood had weathered a little in the months since I'd built it, softening to a warm, silvery brown. It wasn't just a fence anymore. It was a line I had drawn, a statement I had made, and a promise I intended to uphold. As the evening settled, I smiled faintly to myself. My land was quiet, peaceful, and fully mine. No HOA meetings, no surprise fines, no manipulative power plays. Just the sound of the wind through the trees, the sight of my workshop standing solid at the center of my property, and the knowledge that I had stood up, fought back, and won. That night, before turning in, I updated the sign at my gate one last time. This is private land. No HOA, no membership, no exceptions. It wasn't just for the neighbors. It was for me, a reminder that some battles are worth fighting and some victories you never take for granted.